everyone. Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. And for today's episode, we are being joined by James Boyette, who is running for Congress in Montana's 2nd District. He is challenging the incumbent Matt Rosendale in the Republican primary coming up next month in June. James, thank you for joining the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You are the first Republican candidate to come onto my show. So, not too many Republicans, I'm sure, would want to come on to a show that's primarily on the left here. So I appreciate your courage here to come on and kind of answer some of my questions today. But, first and foremost, I kind of want to get right into the issues a little bit here. I'm definitely going to ask you about your aspirations to challenge Matt Rosendale a little bit later on. But first and foremost, when we spoke prior to this, you told me that one of the issues that you're focusing on for your campaign is raising the standards of K through 12 education. And I just want to know exactly, what do you think needs to be changed, and how do you think the federal government should go about doing that?
So I think the main kind of way to address a lot of these issues is putting a little bit more of a focus on the students specifically, where I feel like there's kind of a shortfall across the nation is the teachers are kind of lacking enthusiasm. And I mean, there's pretty decent reason for that, to be honest, with their pay being as low as it is. I want to say the average salary income for K-12 teachers is right around that $40,000 mark. And after taxes, let's be honest, that's not a whole lot. And when it comes to the teachers not only getting paid a lower amount, but also having to oftentimes have second or third jobs on the side, their attention is pretty diverted, and the enthusiasm just isn't quite there. And when it comes to the students specifically, that's where I feel like in today's world especially, there's a very big kind of block in the way, whether it's the political view side of things or religion or you name it. There's a lot of outside interferences that are influencing what exactly is being taught, and that's at the disservice of the kids. And one of the things that I would kind of like to see is there's been this huge focus on the science, math, and the STEM program in general, and then kind of putting a lot of elective type courses like shop or home economics or these other types of classes that help prepare kids for the real world. And those are kind of going to the wayside. And feel like not only bringing the focus back to kids first and their academic excellence is going to be kind of a huge component. And I'd love to see some sort of reimplementation of a program similar to the No Child Left Behind, but also bring a focus back into these elective courses to help prepare our kids for what happens after graduation and prepare them for the real world, so they're not graduating and being like, okay, what do I do now?
Yeah, that's something that I can totally understand. And that there does need to be some restructuring of what is taught to children in schools. It does seem as though that does need to be addressed on some level. I noticed that you mentioned in your answer, though, that you believe that teachers having to work 2 and 3 jobs is probably not the best idea for educators when they're trying to be more enthusiastic about teaching children in schools. Are you in favor of teachers being paid more money?
I am. I believe that there's a lot of different kind of education grants out there, and the area that I think that there's been a lot of misguided direction is there's been this very large focus on hiring teachers that are close in proximity versus teachers who have the highest credentials. So I think that while hiring teachers locally is a great idea in theory, we also need to make sure that there's the credentials to back up the hiring process. And yeah, across the board, I think that all this money that's getting shoveled into the Department of Education, which, I mean, that's a whole different kind of conversation, but if that money was directed to support teachers, maybe instituting something like covering their housing costs or some way of funneling money to the teachers to provide a financial incentive to kind of make their lives easier, or provide some monthly stipends for additional base pay or something along those lines. I think that's definitely within the realm of possibility and something that I'd definitely be supportive of.
Now, I don't want to skate over it because I'm sure that, some people are probably thinking about the elephant in the room right now, which is education has been a big topic of discussion in national politics recently, and you are running for a national audience, or national
Yeah.
office rather. So I do want to come back to this a little bit later in the episode, because I do feel like there has to be, I do have to address the question in the room, which is, your thoughts about the current state of the Republican Party and how they are treating education right now, as far as like how they're essentially going after it. But let me transition to something else involving government spending right now, because one of the other things that you had stated on your platform is that you want to address military weakness. Now, as somebody on the left, and I think we had this conversation, prior, when I hear that, I can't wrap my head around what exactly that means. We have the largest military in the world. It dwarfs any other military many times over. I think the next was like 10 countries combined, like spend less than we do, and on top of that fact, President Biden has just authorized, the increase in more military spending than was spent underneath Donald Trump. So for me, I can't grasp how military weakness could even be, something that someone would say. So I want to hear precisely what you mean by that. And rather than traditional military power, should we be focusing more on maybe something like cybersecurity in this new digital age? What are your thoughts on these things?
So kind of break that down on a couple components. So first, brought the military spending up. So in terms of military spending, I think that that is the area that has been drastically abused. And I mean, just as an example, the F-35s, which they're really not that old, all of the F-35, or sorry, 43% of the F-35 fleet is going to be quote unquote obsolete and no longer serviceable by 2030, which is going to be billions and billions of dollars that are just being wasted for whatever reason, where they're just going to stop servicing. And then on top of that, just within the DoD itself, over the last few years, they've got specific investigative units looking at fraud and wasted spending. And from 2013 to 2017, they had found over $6.6 billion just in DoD fraud cases. And that's just 395 out of 1,700 investigations. So that's just literally, what, 20% of all their investigations, and they already found almost $7 billion in just wasted spending. And on top of that, just look at the Navy. They're in the process of decommissioning 24 warships, and the Navy's turning around and wanting new funding to add 9 new ships. A lot of the wasted spending can be traced down to kind of differentiating between what is actually needed versus what's wanted. Because everybody wants the fancy new stuff, but is it a need? No. And then when you're looking at all the money that's spent on the military around the world, I think that a lot of our resources are being spent in the wrong direction. And in a lot of these nations that we do have military bases of some sort, all of that is coming from American taxpayer money. But if we have bases in a country and the clause or whatever is specifically geared for the protection or the deterrence of threats in a specific country, I think that it'd be perfectly fair if that country were to have to pay some sort of a stipend to help support the bases so that it's not all American taxpayer money that's coming out. Now, the other kind of portion there, you mentioned the cybersecurity. I just based on looking through this, we've already got cybersecurity kind of every single branch out there. And I think that cybersecurity is definitely something that we should be paying attention to. But based on the funding and the FBI, CIA, NSA, HHS, and every branch of the government having dedicated cybersecurity specialists, I think that the cybersecurity already has the funding it needs. We just need to be smarter about how we're approaching situations. And on the just military weakness side of things, and kind of where I came with that, is basically coming down to not necessarily the military size and resources, but the lack of common sense from our leaders and the way that we're going about situations, like take Afghanistan, for example. Should we have had troops in there as long as we have? Maybe, maybe not. But as it was clearly pretty evident, just the presence there was deterring a lot of actions. And as soon as the military forces were taken out, we saw what happened. And when it comes to how we're addressing North Korea or China or Russia, I think that there's been a lot of oversight or overlooking, I should say, when it comes to the deterrence factor and how to properly deter military action from these aggressive countries. And it's turned into we'll just talk, sit back, and see what happens, when everyone knows what's going to happen. Everyone knew that if there wasn't some strong deterrence, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. It's already happened before with Crimea. But it seems like the current military leaders are more prone to just sit back and wait for something to happen and then start taking action instead of taking preventive measures.
Okay. And, let me just ask a quick follow-up on that, and you don't have to go into too much detail on this, but, I've heard a lot of members of Congress talk about the fact that Congress should have the power to send, troops into combat or that of any sort. Do you believe that, going into any military conflict whatsoever should solely rest with the House of Representatives and with the Senate? Or do you think that the president should maintain the ability to send troops when need be?
So I think at the end of the day, there should kind of be a little bit of both, just because if we say, for example, have the input of the House of Representatives that is representing the nation as a whole, and then you have the president, if the president's going senile and he's like, all right, throw a nuke, send all the troops over, then you can have the House being like, let's kind of take a vote on this, see if this is actually what's in the best interest for the American people, and vice versa. So I think that, especially when it comes to sending troops over to fight, and whenever there's war, there's going to be death, there needs to be some accountability and some checks and balances instead of just a rash decision.
Okay. So, speaking of the House, let's kind of get to the elephant in the room here. You are running against an incumbent here in Montana in the 2nd District. Matt Rosendale holds that seat currently. You are running against him in the primary. Why are you running against Matt Rosendale, and why do you think you would be a better representative for the district than he currently is?
So the main reason that decided to run against Matt Rosendale is because I had seen that his actions just weren't aligning with his words. There was a lot of talking, a lot of these headline grabby kind of topics that he seemed to be pushing. And that's kind of what initially sparked the idea of even entering politics to begin with. And then after meeting him in person and hearing him talk a few times, just had the overwhelming sense that he was spewing a bunch of BS. And that kind of got the juices flowing, and started doing some research on kind of what his actual track record was. And that's where it kind of turned into a laundry list of lawsuits over misuse of campaign funds, promising to protect public lands in Montana, and siding with private billionaires to transfer public land into private ownership. And this whole kind of broad spectrum where he says one thing and then his actions are the complete and polar opposite. And that's not something that really sits very well with me. I think that if you're going to be in a position where you're representing the people, you need to be honest, and you need to actually have a sense of a moral compass. And if you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. So when it comes to why I feel like I'd be a better candidate than Matt Rosendale, is because I believe in being honest, being transparent. And he uses this line at pretty much every single Lincoln Reagan dinner that I've been at, that I've heard him speak, of him boasting about all of his no votes and saying that the Democrats always want to push their ideas and they always want his vote and all that kind of stuff. And then he states, well, I've got ideas too. And I'm just sitting around on a Friday night like a little girl waiting for that phone call. And that's where I'm kind of like, okay, if you're just sitting around waiting for people to call you and you're not willing to reach out and engage in these debates, these conversations, these discussions with a political party or people across the aisle that maybe you don't fully agree with, you need to buck up and actually have these conversations, because like it or not, there's a few elected individuals that maybe this doesn't apply to, but when you're elected in a position for Congress, Senate, President, whatever it may be, your purpose is to do what's right by the American people. That's the overall baseline of why you're there. And if you're not willing to get over your personal differences and work towards something that's for the common good of the American people, then you need to step aside and let someone else come in and do so. And just as a couple of examples, I mean, being on this podcast with you, I don't care if you've got different opinions or beliefs than I do. We've kind of talked about that. It's about open dialogue back and forth, listening to each other, hearing out our differences, not disliking each other for it, but actually being willing to listen and respect what the other person has to say. And that's something that he hasn't done. And with the Montana Farmers Union debate last week, this is the third time that he's declined to even attend a debate about agriculture. 2018, 2020, and now 2022, when the agriculture industry is one of the largest, especially in the state of Montana. One of them.
Yeah.
It's there's a lot of others that have kind of been working up, but it's still top 10. And for him not being willing to actually show support, that was kind of astounding. And then you take this open forum that is being put on by Ford Montana, the Ford Party in Billings in 2 weeks now, and he already declined that, like already. And that's a group that is put together by younger voters who are trying to figure out what's going on in the political world. And when your own U.S. congressman declines to even show up to an event to provide a face or viewpoint to the younger voters that's going to be a part of this upcoming generation, that kind of speaks volumes. And I believe that as a representative, and what I bring to the table is I care. I'm more than happy to have open dialogue, more than happy to show up and talk to anyone, regardless of political beliefs, religious beliefs, you name it. Because as a representative, you have to be willing to listen to everyone and hear their concerns, hear the issues that are going on. And only then, when you've gained perspective on what exactly is happening, can you even think about taking actions to address any of these.
Okay. Well, thank you, for telling me your feelings on that. I will have some more questions about Matt Rosendale coming up. But first, we're going to take a quick break in this episode. And when we come back, we'll have some more questions about, immigration, homelessness, and the current state of the Republican Party. So stay tuned. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. We are still joined here by our congressional candidate, James Boyette. James, again, we were talking about before, you are running in the Republican primary against Matt Rosendale from Montana's 2nd District. There's a lot of different things going on in the country right now that, I've seen that you address on your platform. So we're just going to let's take a look at one in particular that I know has been getting a lot of attention. Right now at the southern border, our immigration policies are being essentially attacked by the Republican Party. They're saying that Joe Biden is not doing enough. What exactly do you think needs to be done differently? And what do you think is the mistakes that have been made during this administration?
So I think the things that could and should be done differently is stop the catch and release, and anyone that's choosing to enter the country illegally and not go through the legal process unless they have a good asylum claim, they don't need to be put on buses and just sent anywhere in the U.S. I mean, as we've been seeing across the country, especially with the fentanyl drug trafficking side of things, there's a lot of ramifications to just letting illegal immigrants come in without going through a proper vetting process. And I feel like first and foremost, we need to make sure that anyone that is coming into the country illegally should have, at the bare minimum, a initial hearing or background check or something set up that's actually vetting them, instead of someone comes in, okay, well, here's your notice to appear, have fun, see you later. Oh, by the way, here's a brand new cell phone. That ain't working. And the amount of crime that's been coming as a direct result of that kind of throughout the country. I mean, there's plenty of other crime going on too, but the amount of crime that is being linked directly to illegal immigrants who are participating in these crimes, and especially with the fentanyl and the amount of deaths across the country and even here in Montana that are a direct result of the fentanyl drugs being brought in, that kind of stuff we need to actually be proactive about and not wait until it's here in our country, injuring, hurting, killing American citizens. We need to be enforcing our border policies, and anyone that wants to come in if they're from a country or a location where there's some sort of genocide, or if their life is at risk, then we need to go with the original use of the asylum seeking purpose. If it's someone that's just trying to come into the country just because they know that Biden is not going to expel them, that part we need to enforce some standards, not just allow people to cross the Rio Grande and come into the country and then be caught by Border Patrol and then released.
So the question, I'm sorry, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
The question I wanted to ask you about this particularly, it feels like there's a slight misnomer when it comes to Joe Biden, and I'm not his fan in any means necessary. So like, I'm not trying to seem like I'm overly defending him here, but if just looking at statistics, it would seem as though Joe Biden spent the first part of 2021 deporting more people than President Trump did in the year of 2020. So the idea that President Biden isn't deporting people seems to be fictitious. Now, it seems as though like the policy is at the southern border, besides, family separation, haven't changed at all between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Like the status quo seems to be maintained. With that being said, why is it that he's being I guess attacked in a way that President Trump was not?
So I guess the short answer to that is, with the Trump administration, they did have the ICE program and there were the expulsions. And I mean, you remember the news stories of AOC down crying at the fences about like the kids in cages and all that kind of stuff. And under the Biden administration, and I mean, this isn't just on Biden himself. I mean, look at the border czar, Kamala Harris, and the farthest that she went into Texas is to what is it? Not San Antonio, El Paso, which is in a section where the border wall is complete, but hasn't gone any farther south. And Biden, to date, as far as I know, hasn't been down to the border, hasn't seen kind of what's been going on. And I think that the public perception of knowing that they haven't been down there to see firsthand what's going on and what people are facing definitely weighs to the criticism. But even when you've got Border Patrol agents on the news, whether it's Fox News, CNN, or wherever else, and they're actively saying that they're not getting any support, and hearing firsthand from these Border Patrol agents on the vast differences between the Trump administration and now, where they feel like they can't do their jobs without having repercussions or being accused of whipping or whatever it may be. I think the lack of support from the Biden administration as a whole, and then the firsthand accounts that we hear, whether they're 100% factual or not, hearing it directly from the horse's mouth on those that are there day in and day out, that's something that plays pretty heavily into that perception. And I know for me personally, that's something that hearing directly from a source, that means a lot more to me than just hearing news stations or politicians saying something that they aren't or haven't experienced firsthand.
Okay, so let me switch gears a little bit here. Another one of the things on your platform is talking about homelessness. And this is a topic that typically when I hear Republicans talking about this, there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of what I would refer to as humane solutions. So I'm interested in hearing what exactly your thoughts on this problem are, and how exactly can the federal government do something to address the rampant, like unhoused, like epidemic that's going on in our country right now.
So first and foremost, what the government can do is actually allocate the homeless budget to the homeless. Right now, if you look at the budget kind of breakdown of where that funding is going, it's going to everything from flights, hotels, travel costs for people to talk about homelessness. It's going to people that put on conventions or these grand seminars to talk about homelessness. It ain't going to solve the homeless crisis. It's going to people to talk about something that they're not doing anything to fix. I mean, if you look at California and all these tents and all that kind of stuff, their solution to solve the homeless crisis is let them be homeless and give them some sort of a tax break or give them tents or something like that so that they can be sheltered homeless. None of that's going to solve the issue. When look at just the overall funding, and just an example with the illegal immigration, there was 10.5 billion in tax credits that went to non-US citizens. And when you take into account the additional amount of money that costs the US to deal with different illegal immigration issues, whether it's drugs, crime, whatever it may be, if you take all of that money collectively and were to put it to the actual homeless problem and reallocate the budget that's titled for homelessness in the US federal budget and put that towards the homeless citizens, then you would literally be able to build a single family house for every single homeless citizen and family in the US. But that's too much. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that there's quite a few homes throughout the country that are not even occupied. So
17 million.
When it comes to the federal government, they can either allocate money to put these people in a home and provide them some sort of kickstart program where they can get clean if they're on any drugs, they can get back into education, whether they've completed their education or not, provide some job skills training or something along those lines. Or even if they're wanting to do something on a smaller scale, then one idea that I'd have is if you set up basically an apartment type complex, cuts down the cost a little bit instead of building all these extra houses. And within that complex, institute programs that address the mental health, rehabilitation, if, like I said, if they are on any sort of drugs, to help them get clean. Institute programs that help with the education and provide on-site job type trainings, whether it's skills to be a plumber, to be a builder, to be a landscaper, or build small complexes, maybe a bakery, maybe some auto shop or something like that, where you've got on the job or on-site training where they can help pay for the rent through work, through learning, and help them become members of society again, help them kind of restart their lives. A vast majority of these homeless, once they're homeless, they've got the stamp tagged on them, and it seems like nobody even wants to touch or interact with them at all, when a vast majority of the time, the only difference between me and them is I got a lucky break somewhere and they didn't happen to get that kind of lucky break. Maybe they lost their house during the recession. Maybe they had a bunch of medical bills that made them go bankrupt, or who knows. But just treating them like they're these deplorables is not the answer. You have to invest in the homeless and actually treat them with respect and give them the value and respect that they're deserved and owed, and help them become contributing members of society. If there's one thing that I've been taught is if someone sees value in you, you're more likely to do something with your life. If someone sees you as worthless, then you're going to continue to think that you're worthless. And right now, we've got an issue where not only are our officials, the US, you name it, seeing homeless as worthless, but it's an even bigger slap in the face when they're using taxpayer funding to solve homeless crises without even doing anything to address it. Just talk.
Okay. And yeah, I appreciate you, definitely humanizing a little bit more. It's an important thing when we're having these discussions to hear people say that, because you're right. Too often we do talk about, well, not just like we, but, people in society will talk about people who are homeless as if they've somehow, like they've put themselves there through like laziness, or they no longer care about their lives. And it's very detached from the reality for most of those people. But speaking of, you know, people who are essentially been left behind. I do want to take a quick moment to talk about something that is very particular to the state of Montana, which is the murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. Now, this is something that here in Montana we're pretty familiar with, but for people who live outside the state, they may not be as familiar with this. Can you just go into a little bit about what the government can do to address this issue? And also, would you mind telling the audience what you heard when you spoke with our current attorney general about how he felt about this issue?
So, yeah, kind of as a beginning kind of intro portion. So when it comes to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children in the state of Montana, compared to any other ethnicities, they're 10 times more likely to be murdered. And for Indigenous women and children, murder is the third leading cause of death. That's ridiculous. And more than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women have experienced some sort of violence, whether it's assault, sexual assault, you name it. 4 out of 5. Over half have experienced the actual sexual assault portion. And when it comes to the way that the reservations are set up and the cooperation with the US government, the amount of women and children who are subjected to murder, rape, just go missing, anything like that, only a small portion is ever even reported to the federal authorities. And it's this huge disconnect where if these reservations are in need of additional resources and support, it's become so divided where they're constantly asking for help, begging for it in most cases, especially in missing persons cases. And only a small percentage of the time do they get any sort of support from state or federal government, especially when tribal police reach out and ask for additional help. Now, when you brought up the comment from our Attorney General, Austin Knudsen, he, in kind of a short type phrase, I asked him what exactly is being done to assist the reservations with the crime rates. And he essentially said, well, there's not really anything that we can do because they want to handle it internally. And I asked him, okay, well, when it comes to the missing persons, there's thousands and thousands that have gone missing over the years. What about those cases? Like, can we not maybe work with these communities, these reservations, to set up some sort of collaborative effort between the state or federal police or agencies to provide assistance? And he just kind of shrugged it off and said, well, they don't really want our help. I find that very, very hard to believe, because if it doesn't matter what law enforcement you're in, if it's state, if it's federal, if it's tribal police, no matter what, at the end of the day, your purpose is to protect and serve. And on numerous occasions, I've seen and heard firsthand tribal police asking for additional resources, asking for help. And I find it very hard to believe that if I were to get elected and set up some sort of communication with the tribal police, with the Indian Affairs, with the FBI or whoever, and actually sat down and talked to them of, in these kind of situations, what can we do to provide some sort of collaborative effort to support the tribal police in addressing these issues? I find it very, very unlikely that we wouldn't be able to find some sort of solution. To me, it seems more like a pop out and trying to take the easy way of, well, they solve their stuff, we solve ours. Like it or not, we're all in the same country. We all live together, and we should be supporting each other. And with the reservations being in the position that they are, where they've got businesses, schools, hospitals that are lacking resources, whether it's internet, whether it's the ability to upgrade their buildings or whatever it may be, we owe it to them to make sure that they have every resource that they need. And especially on the law enforcement side, there's simple things that we could do from the government down, like maybe increasing the funding so that they can hire more tribal police, maybe increase funding so that they're able to put up different security traffic cams or something like that, so that when someone comes through and commits a crime or abducts someone, or for God forbid, murder someone, we can at least track their movements and see where they went. Right now, there's nothing.
Yeah, and go
ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think the thing that you said earlier is something that I really want to. It's a nice place to transition to my final question here, which was you were talking about the fact that we all share this country together. Now, I couldn't get you out of here without talking about the Republican Party on a national level. You are running for a federal office. If you were to win, you'd be sharing a chamber with the rest of, like your caucus. Another member of your presumptive caucus, if you were to win, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has been in the news quite a bit recently for many reasons, but one in particular is for saying that everyone who's a Democrat is like a groomer and a pedophile. Now, a couple of years ago, these were probably some of the most heinous insults you could throw at a person. In recent times, it feels as though the Republican Party has latched onto them as like basically just like a word they can throw at anyone who not only labels himself a Democrat or somebody who votes Democrat. It feels incredibly destructive from my personal perspective. Do you think that Representative Greene and other members of the Republican Party, do you think it's okay for them to just throw around this word to basically anybody who votes differently than them?
No. And when it comes to being in a elected position or just a American citizen, period, it's so easy to label a population by itself, like Republican, Democrat, or football players, or whatever it may be. But to make a generalized statement about several hundred people, thousands across the country in different positions, that not only is it not fair, but it's 100% not true. If you got one bad apple, that doesn't mean the entire bushel is rotten. Same kind of thing with the Trump portion. People didn't like Trump for a wide variety of reasons. And then it turned into a situation where if you're a Republican, you're associated with Trump, instant dislike. But for Marjorie Taylor Greene to make that kind of comment, uncalled for. And even here recently, she called out Dan Crenshaw and was saying something along the lines of, you're either a Democrat or you're just stupid. And I don't know about you, but I respect Dan Crenshaw for a lot of reasons. And when there's this name calling and that kind of stuff, either they're way misinformed, too lazy to actually do the research, or they're just trying to gain some sort of publicity and stuck in the idea that any publicity is good publicity, even if it makes you look like an ass. And I mean, at the end of the day, we need to actually start treating individuals as individuals, not as a group as a whole. And even on the Democratic side, even though there's quite a few that I don't agree with, I'm not going to start branching out and calling them a bunch of names as a whole, as much as there might be sometimes that I want to. I mean, same with the Republican side, same with a lot of groups. Just because there's one person that you don't agree with or you have strong feelings towards doesn't give the right to make a generalized blanket statement.
You know what? I appreciate you saying that. Definitely needs to be a little more civility in our politics right now, and it is more than lacking on both sides. For those who are interested in learning more about you and your campaign, where can people find you at?
So my website is Boyette, Boyette, for Congress, FOR, Congress.com, or my Instagram we'll start with Instagram. It's Boyette 4 Congress. And then as of yesterday, finally got a Twitter, and that's Boyette 4 MT for Montana.
Okay. And people, if you are interested, there'll be some links in the episode description, so you can go ahead and check those out there. One last thing, when exactly does voting begin in Montana? And I guess make your very quick final pitch about why you're a better candidate than Matt Rosendale.
So early voting begins on May 13th. That's when the ballots are going out. And then the actual election day is June 7th. And basically why I'm asking for your vote and why you should vote for me is because, just like here on this podcast, I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to be someone that cares, that actually wants to make a difference and is willing to listen to views and opinions from all sides and be willing to actually engage in constructive debate, not tear down the other person, and just be willing to be focused on how I can make things better for the American people, for the people in Montana, and give everything that I have to give you a representative that is actually going to be honest, transparent, and be someone that's going to be fighting for you day in and day out.
All right, James Boyette, thank you again so much for being on the podcast today. For everyone else, thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video.